Question. Hi, Robert. I'm taking another trip through the 10,000 things, and it is interesting to see some things pop out clearly that I had not noticed the first time. As you know, I've been whining about loneliness for some time. My old friends who are wrapped up in spirituality no longer like the things I say, and I don't get much from them either. Feeling so alone no longer takes me way down into the darkness of existential death as it used to, but still there is the sense of a hole in space, an uncomfortable openness. It is something rather unnerving, a sense of nothingness that the wind blows right through. In Chapter 5 of 4T you say, quote, "Unless you find yourself alone like that, without taking refuge in second-hand notions, no matter what their source, you will never be free, but will remain always an adherent, forever a disciple or an epigon." When I say find yourself alone, I do not mean alone socially. I mean alone in the comprehension that your indefinable presence in this mysterious stream of energy we call life brings your world into being, not the world, but your world. Unquote. When I read this, it felt like being flipped into a deeper understanding. But now as I write, that understanding is lost. I think it has something to do with trying to fit in and to see the world as others seem to see it. What if this actually were my world, as you say? Suddenly, I'd not be trying to live in someone else's world with their views and opinions, but I'd just be seeing what I see. I feel as if I might be coming through the back door on this. Also, there was another flip into an even deeper place when you asked, what if it's just okay to think whatever is being thought, whatever arises, without judgment or censorship? Now that was a revolutionary idea, especially after all the meditation groups, the books, and the rest of my cultural programming. Say what? Did I really just hear that? Just be okay with whatever thought was passing through my mind? To be able to experience this world on that basis would be completely liberating. I feel liberated by just hearing the idea. This constant judgment of thoughts, this incessant judgment, what the hell? Would you give me a little feedback here on the empty hole of loneliness with the wind blowing through it? Answer. Yes, I will. As Jimi Hendrix, guitar in hand, raging on psychedelics once said, loneliness is such a drag. Jimmy was right. It can feel like a drag or worse to admit that one will never be completely seen, heard, or understood by anyone, including oneself. But if we truly desire the unconditional freedom of awakeness, we must make peace with the plain fact that each of us, in the depths of our being, is very much alone, was born alone, and will die alone. No one will ever know the fullness of what we have gone through and what we find ourselves going through presently, moment by moment. I can't even know all that about myself, much less anyone else. If good fortune has provided an understanding friend or partner, we can, of course, discuss our feelings, perhaps share anecdotes, confessions, and commiserations with one another about the human condition in general, and one's own sad state in particular. And this can be a beautiful side of friendship. But at some point, any conversation must end, and there one is, alone again. My mother died recently at 99 years of age. We'd been great friends, and I loved her. But I can't love her anymore. Love ends, and then what we love are memories. Memories of love are not love, nor is loving a memory anything like loving a living being, which happens only in the present. Years ago, I told you that we humans are composed physically of the same stardust, atoms, and molecules from cosmic space, which fact I'd heard from Carl Sagan. But psychologically and philosophically, it seems to me, we can be as far away from one another as the stars in the sky. Yes, we all share this aliveness, but the perspective of one mind could be light years distant from that of another. This is part of what I meant when I said, not the world, but your world. Each of us lives in a world of our own, because each of us sees what we see in ways that are self-centered and uniquely self-referential. The idea of objective consciousness, which somehow is accorded axiomatic status, just assumed without evidence to exist, for me has the ontological status of a unicorn. You can talk about it and try to imagine it, but objective consciousness does not exist, except conceptually. Please be clear on this. No matter what some master may claim, objective consciousness does not exist. You see what you see. You may disagree, and if you do, fine by me. Throughout this entire book, I am saying what I see, not trying to define reality for anyone else. I used to tell the story of a bunch of teenage boys hanging out in the street and catcalling at the girls that pass. "Hey, baby, how about a taste? Come on, baby, give it up." They're all into this game with clear reference in male-dominant mating rituals, until one particular girl approaches. This time, when the harassment begins, one guy dissents forcefully. "Hey, shut the fuck up," he tells his amigos. "That's my sister." So that's his world he's asserting, his point of view, his consciousness. In his world, that young woman is not perceived as some random babe you'd like to take home and mess around with, but a member of his family who must, at all costs, be protected and respected. This example is not meant to illustrate the incest taboo, although it would serve well for that, but to demonstrate how each of us lives in a separate world of our own, primarily unconscious making. What you call the world is the world of your own mind. Still, assuming sufficient willingness and intellect, factual information, the kinds of statements that seem to correspond accurately to the material world, can be exchanged more or less easily with other minds. "It's raining," or "humans have 12 ribs." To a far lesser extent, views, opinions, and abstract ideas can be passed from one mind to another with at least some coherence. However, feelings are not nearly so amenable to being communicated, and one's personal phenomenology is comprised largely of feelings, often barely expressible or entirely inexpressible. So the fact is that you don't know what I feel or what I experience. You never will to the fullest, and I cannot explain it to you. Describing my feelings verbally won't go far, because a word can mean only what the hearer thinks it means based on past experience. You may want to know what I feel. You may even imagine that you do know what I feel, but you don't. You really know only your own feelings, to the extent they have not been pushed into the shadows or eclipsed entirely, and what you imagine you might feel under the circumstances. What you hear in my words I am saying is your mind, not mine. This inability to be outside one's own mind is one implication of my saying that each of us is essentially alone, that each of us resides, without objective knowledge or final answers, in the vastness and free fall of this mind space that we call the universe. Some of us, of course, personify and commodify it as God, as an obeisance to or as actual participants in the superstitions of our ancestors, who in the eons before science had no other explanation for events, whether catastrophic or beneficent, other than that a powerful deity intentionally produced and controlled those events. In their ignorance of natural causes, our forebears learned to propitiate and pray, and since sacrificing infants or praying in special words for what one desired sometimes did seem to work, they kept it up. That is how superstition is born and thrives. When those methods failed, they could always inculpate a member of the tribe as the cause of the deity's wrath, and drive that human scapegoat out of the village, or stone him to death. Maybe that would help. Sometimes it did. Artistic modes, poetry, music, dance, visual images, often work better than just ordinary speech for communication of feelings and emotions. But no matter how adept an artist might be, she or he will never fully bridge the gap between one mind and another. To be honest with ourselves and one another, we must admit that. Each of us is existentially alone with our own thoughts and feelings. Expressing some of them in words or otherwise may help to ease the sense of loneliness, but the aloneness is still there and always will be. Many of us cannot tolerate the implications of that fact, that essentially one is alone in the world of one's own mind. So we resort to papering that aloneness over, often by means of binding ourselves to an identity, or more likely to an assemblage of identities composed of gender, nationality, social class, ethnicity, religion, so-called race, political outlook, economic status, or the Michael Jackson fan club for that matter. With every such identification, one asserts, declares, and affirms belonging to a subgroup, to a regime with rules, customs, and commandments of its own. Recently, identifying as has become a thing, and for many people, the central focus of their lives, so this is a sensitive area to dissect. In looking into it, I am bound to step on toes, although that is not my intention, not at all. But questions such as yours cannot be considered properly without examining this matter free of the need to respect the prevailing cognitive biases with which many, if not most people, regard the human condition. To be clear, I am not saying that identifying as exists only as a way of dealing with the essential human aloneness that cannot be denied. You were born alone into a world you never made or chose, and will die alone. That is part of it, a large part perhaps, but the matter of identification is more complex than that. To begin with, not all identities are self-selected. Certain identities are imposed upon us by the attitudes of the wider social surround. If, for example, you live in Chicago and have dark skin, you really cannot avoid at least some identification as a person of color. Others will view you that way, and some of them will judge you on that basis, which is racism. Refusing to identify as a so-called person of color will not make that kind of racism disappear. How you are regarded by ignorant others is not your choice. But if you live in Northwest Africa, in Benin for example, where one can spend days without seeing anyone with light-colored skin, you will not be seen primarily as a person of color, and do not necessarily need to identify that way. There you are just a person, or perhaps a Beninese, which is a national identity, not a racial one. One way to deal with discrimination due to so-called race or gender or sexual preferences is to make common cause with others subjected to the same bigotry for consolation, protection, connection, and the possibility that unified efforts might move the social order in the direction of greater justice. That may be important, or even a matter of life and death, so I do not mean that one can simply stop identifying entirely. That's not the idea. Nevertheless, and surely this will offend some readers, identifying as is intrinsically a lie. It's a lie when imposed upon us culturally. For example, I have dark skin and someone calls me black, and equally a lie when we internalize the cultural surround and impose identities upon ourselves. I call myself black. Our true identity, I say, is this aliveness and the faculty of self-awareness that comes with it. All the rest is an add-on, largely a set of misconceptions and ignorant social constructions. I refer to race in scare quotes and label it as so-called because the idea that someone is black or white is nothing but a myth, in the sense of an unsound, fallacious idea, a false idea. The idea of race is so deeply embedded within our culture, and all our minds are so deeply conditioned to believe in it, that my calling race a myth may seem crazy, but it is a myth in the sense that race exists only conceptually. Since those concepts are racist by their very nature, using the words white and black to refer to people is a form of unwitting collusion and racism, driven by social compliance. Others say black and white, and so you do it too. Yes, it may seem convenient to use the words white and black to refer to people when you only mean to indicate one person or another, as in, for example, that white guy over there. I have said such words myself, but I've come to feel that it is worth the effort to avoid that mode completely and to find other ways to point someone out, just as one must do in a room full of people who all have a similar skin tone. That tall guy over there, the one with the green shirt. Race is a concept defined by society, not by genes. I'm not denying that we human animals differ genetically due to ancestry, but race is a myth. because the imputation of racial identity to one person or another based on ancestry is a fabrication, a canard and nothing more, regardless of how many people believe in it. Believe what you will. Here is the science. Quote, "There is no genetic sequence unique to blacks or whites or Asians. In fact, these categories don't reflect biological groupings at all. There is more genetic variation in the diverse populations from the continent of Africa, who some would lump into a black category, than exists in all populations from outside of Africa, the entire rest of the world combined. Dark or light skin tells us only about a particular human's amount of ancestry relative to the equator, not anything about the specific population or part of the planet he or she might be descended from. There is not a single biological element unique to any of the groups we call white, black, Asian, Latino, etc. This is not to say that humans don't vary biologically. We do, a lot, but rather that those variations are not racially distributed." Unquote. Agustin Fuentes, Ph.D. This is not just an opinion of mine or of Dr. Fuentes. The following are the words of a cutting-edge geneticist. Quote, "My laboratory discovered in 2016, based on our sequencing of ancient human genomes, that whites are not derived from a population that existed from time immemorial, as some people believe. Instead, whites represent a mixture of 4 ancient populations that lived 10,000 years ago, and were each as different from one another as Europeans and East Asians are today." Unquote. Dr. David Reich, Ph.D. And another, quote, "There is no definition of race that corresponds with variation in DNA. Race is not defined by DNA. We've known this for quite some time now, and we largely abandoned the term race in biology decades ago for this reason. Race most certainly exists as a social construct, but folk and colloquial racial definitions correspond poorly to human variation in DNA." Unquote. Dr. Adam Rutherford. And another, quote, "The concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis." Unquote. Craig Venter, who led the first draft sequence of the human genome. And finally, quote, "Problems arise when meaning is made from superficial genetic differences. It's a fairly short leap to the incorrect conclusion that peoples, in addition to their similar surface-level physical attributes, might have different psychological, physical, or intellectual attributes. It's such a pervasive, simple idea that it can lead us to believe that it's actually true, normal, or natural. It's a powerful idea that in many ways we have structured our society around. This is so true that after 60 years of scholarship, which says over and over and over that it is not true, this simple idea may still be shocking." Unquote. Paul B. Sturdivant, Is Race Real? In that view, which is the consensus view of genetics, so-called race has no biological meaning at all. No one is black. No one. To regard someone as black is a lie that tells us nothing factual about that person. This does not mean that racism is not real. On the social level, of course racism is real as a heart attack. But racism is based on a false premise, so-called race, which is a word like mermaid, without any factual correspondence to the actual physical world. The point of this chapter is not to deny that most people use terms like white man or person of color as if they refer to something real, but to indicate that in my view, to the extent that you believe such terms refer to something real, you, like most people, have been hypnotized by the erroneous, ignorant conceptions of the generalized cultural surround. And until you snap out of that hypnotic trance, you will never be what I call awake. In 20th century USA, some states enacted into law the so-called one-drop rule, which asserted that any person with even one ancestor of sub-Saharan African ancestry, no matter how distant, one drop of black blood, was considered black, or Negro as the word was back then in my youth. And the racism embedded in this one-drop idea became even more obvious by the rule of hypodescent, which meant that children of a mixed union between different racial groups, the children of miscegenation as it was called, would belong automatically to the group with the lower status, regardless of the proportion of ancestry in different groups. No one is a Negro any longer, but still, in the United States, a person is black if he or she has any sub-Saharan African ancestry at all, as if blackness were a kind of stigma, the slightest trace of which marked someone indelibly. In Brazil, this matter is seen and adjudicated along lines that are the polar opposite of the one-drop rule. There, a person is not black if he is known to have any European ancestry at all. Why is Barack Obama black? Why is Mariah Carey black? Why is Tiger Woods black? Why is Halle Berry black? They are not black, I say, and neither is anyone else, even if they, having internalized the one-drop rule, now identify as black. If you have dark skin, others in their ignorance might refer to you as black, but that doesn't mean you must call yourself black. Racism is toxic. It is a poison that has no legitimate use. Race is a lie. Let us not, I am saying, allow the racists to define reality for us. This is not to say that one particular human population, somewhat isolated by geography and breeding mostly within its own members, does not evolve in ways different from another such isolated genetic concentration. Clearly that has occurred and continues to occur. Height, for example, is a heritable trait, so that on average certain population groups are taller and others shorter. Such variation can apply to any heritable trait, but that is the average we are talking about, not the individual. An individual human is just that, a singular case with all kinds of traits that may diverge widely from the average. In fact, usually there is more variance within population groups than between them. To wit, the average Chinese is shorter than the average Netherlander. Adult male height in China is around 1.72 meters, 5 feet 8 inches, quite a bit shorter than the 1.81 meters, just under 6 feet, of the average man in the Netherlands. Nevertheless, the Chinese basketball player Yao Ming, at 2.3 meters, 7 feet 5 inches in height, is taller than any man in Holland, or in most other places for that matter. Averages say nothing about the individual. Social scientists like to use so-called race and ethnicity to make generalized statements about populations. For example, quote, white people in the U.S. commit suicide at nearly 3 times the rate of ethnic minorities, unquote. In my view, that procedure is bogus. It opens the door to errors of all kinds, including the encouraging and supporting of racism, and the statement itself is linguistically unsound. An ethnic minority is a population made up of people who share a common cultural background, not necessarily a common skin color. I understand the desire to split people up that way, particularly for a certain kind of scientist for whom taxonomy is a major approach, but it won't wash. Drawing such boundary lines may be justified by convenience, but from my perspective, such splitting is entirely spurious. There is, I say, no valid racial taxonomy. As a photographer who works almost exclusively in monochrome, I know every shade from darkest black to whitest white, and how to put them on a page. The human face is one of my favorite subjects, so I see skin color just fine. Better than most, I'd reckon. Plain as day. But when I regard a face, I don't see race, and that's part of what I mean by awake. It doesn't take a genius to see people as I do. It's a plain fact, a direct report of my experience. When I look at your face, I don't see a black face or a white face. I see a human face, my own phenomenology of a certain human face. Every face is different, and when I look into your eyes, I don't see white male pain or black lesbian pain. I see only human pain, the phenomenology of human pain. Now, in my experience, this statement is just where an identity politics advocate might misconstrue my point of view as coming from either ignorance or white privilege. Quote, Easy for you to say this, Robert. You are a white man with an Ivy League education and a PhD. You are in like Flynn. You don't need to identify. You can have the luxury of ignoring race. Your pain is not my pain." Unquote. I understand that point of view, and I accept my good luck in being well educated and at peace with my gender. But I will not accept the white part. I refuse to collude in that. I am not white, and I will not allow the history of racism and the unwitting internalization and embrace of racism to label me with that falsehood. If you mean that getting stopped for speeding is a lot less scary for me than it is for a man with dark skin, yes. And just like all of us, I need all the luck I can get. So if the cops don't see me as a suspect, I'll take it. As for the rest, yes, race permeates the entire world culture, and doors are open and closed based on that falsehood. Does that mean that my light skin opened doors that would have been closed to someone like me, but with darker skin? Very likely, but that is not my doing. This is a key point. To go any further into this requires admitting to oneself that justice is a Platonic ideal, not a condition that pertains to human actuality, where everything that can be turned to advantage is turned to advantage. Whatever can be corrupted already is corrupted. Every niche where there is money or privilege to be gotten, legally or illegally, morally or immorally, is filled. You did not make this world. Certainly you had no influence on this life before you were born. No matter what color your skin is, you are not responsible for any of that. This seems logically obvious, but does not go down well with people who focus primarily on injustice. It is unjust, this racism, but so is everything else. Yes, being born with dark skin may be disadvantageous in a milieu of racism, and that is totally unfair. But being born with a dull mind, or a face people find unattractive, is a disadvantage too. We don't get to choose any of this. Guilt is a terrible burden. I have some Austrian friends much younger than me, who, while knowing logically that they were never Nazis and had no influence on anything that occurred years before they were born, still feel somehow implicated. As I say, this is a key point. If that is clear, the subject under discussion here is not racism, although that subject needs plenty of attention. The subject before us concerns identifying as. In pointing out the fallacy of identifying as, so-called race comes into it, because race is off the charts popular as an anchor for identification. I understand that, but here I am clarifying what I mean by awake, which requires going much deeper into what myself is or isn't than just the luck of the draw tribulations of personal appearance and personal history. I am not writing all that off, but pointing to perspectives that can include all that without fixating on any of it. So having been born with the right skin tone, in a sense I would have the luxury of ignoring race if I really could ignore it, but I can't. Of all the stupid self-inflicted wounds of humankind, and they are many, racism is among the worst. My closest friend at Columbia had dark skin. He'd been born a mile from the campus, right in the middle of Harlem, where in those days you'd nary see a light-skinned face. I never thought of my friend as black, nor did he, I imagine, think of me as white, unless that dubious duality was imposed upon us from the outside, such that it needed to be taken into account. This was neither naivete nor colorblindness. It's not that so-called race never came up. It came up frequently. How could it not, in a world so permeated by racism, as we travel together in strange and dangerous locales, sometimes finding ourselves in places where most people had light skin, and sometimes where most had dark skin. It's just that I thought of Joe as this really bright, beautiful friend of mine who could destroy me on a chessboard, not black. Later in life, I played bass in a blues band in which I was the only light-skinned member of the combo. You may not like my ideas on the subject of race, but they cannot be dismissed as coming from ignorance or whiteness. I have pretty much seen it all. Of course I comprehend why the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of slaves would want to assert an historical identity. So much identity was stolen from them, along with all the rest. It's a tragic history, and it's not healed yet. Far from it. This is a hard topic to discuss with candor. We are living in a worldwide bigoted culture. White privilege certainly exists as a major factor in that bigotry. But in stating the facts about so-called race, I am not ignoring that. Rather, I am pointing out how, for those of us who are not racists, splitting the world's people falsely gets in the way of an awakened view of what myself really is. My topic here is not identity politics, but freefall with no handholds. I am being as precise and careful as I can, because once having identified as, having that identification debunked might feel like having the rug pulled out from under you, and that is not my intention. Nor is my perspective in any way a repudiation of the racism afflicting us all. To be clear, racism is a chief feature of human life all over this planet, and that cannot be denied. The loss of any identity, even a false one, can feel like a kind of death, ego death, and if you are racially identified, here I am apparently criticizing that. But if you have read this far and are still reading, perhaps there is something about my perspective on race that seems sane and worth considering. You are not likely to hear this point of view very often, so get it while it's hot. This world can be hard and cruel, and I understand why people who feel marginalized would resort to splitting. If, for example, the straight people want to demean you because of your way of being sexual, or your sense of gender does not fit their narrow biases, well then, you can find a different type of gender that matches you better. That's okay. I'm all for expanding upon established ideas of male and female, and seeing gender more accurately as a spectrum than an either-or. If, for example, you tell me that your gender is non-binary, I get that. Makes perfect sense, actually. But when the notion of gender is split into smaller and smaller subgroups that really have more to do with the need to identify as something special than with anything about sexual expression, the train has jumped the track. Last I heard, we are up to 63 genders. Uh-oh, someone just told me 80 is the latest number that can be displayed on social media, which is, in my view, bonkers. Quote, ether gender, a gender that feels very wide, commanding, breathtaking, and powerful. Zum gender, a gender that is never satisfied with itself due to constant self-doubt or identity issues, causing one to compulsively search and seek out the perfect gender, or the one truth. Unquote. Oh, please, what arrant horseshit. Gender, in my view, is not about whether you feel breathtaking and powerful or you don't. Gender is related to sexuality and its expression, not whether you feel breathtaking or have doubts. To me, the word gender refers to one's own understanding about whether one is a man or a woman, something in between, or none of that. So in this view, your sex refers to actual physical organs at birth, and to which category biology caused you to be assigned. And gender is how you feel and think that applies to you. Gender is about how you think and feel about your sexuality, not about trying to fit into one of dozens of cubbyholes. But it's not quite that straightforward. There are differences in brain structure between men and women that cannot be ignored, some of them major. Even 15 years ago, that idea was distinctly out of favor, but technological advances have revealed and measured those differences with clarity. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but the entire topic of sex and gender is already fraught, and likely to become even more conflict-laden as the politics of gender identification meets neuropsychology. So it falls to us, the dissidents, the awake ones, the lobsters who manage to climb out of the pot, out of the identify as chowder, to assert that we see individuals as individuals and not identified as anything. That is why you must not expect me to focus upon your chosen identity as a chief feature of your being. You may need, for one reason or another, to identify as, and I will respect that, but I don't see people that way, and am I glad I don't. Getting back to ethnicity for a moment, ethnicity means shared culture, not shared appearance. Ethnicity has nothing to do with so-called race, although those who like to think in racial terms believe it does. Ethnic is unequivocally not an apt or proper synonym for non-white, although some people, including even very bright, well-educated people, use it that way. So now that we have been around that block, who are these suicidal white people in the U.S. that the social scientists are blathering about? And anyway, apart from statistics, your particular shade of skin color says nothing at all about whether you will commit suicide, regardless of how you identify. There are plenty of so-called black people taking their own lives every day, I am sure. Humans are not averages. Our deepest and most authentic being has no color, and most of us feel that. This is a fraught topic, thrown completely off kilter by identity politics, which is founded on the expectation and requirement that one's views will unvaryingly support the agenda of our side, including a kind of self-hypnotic ritual consisting of intentionally fanning the flames of one's own cognitive biases while throwing shade on any idea to the contrary, regardless of how well substantiated. As Susan Dunn wrote of the French Revolution, quote, "Any distinction between their own political adversaries and the people's enemies was obliterated," unquote. This is a prescription for ignorance. In considering the matter of so-called race, the easiest shade to throw is not that one view or another is erroneous or misconceived, but that except for the ones on our side, anyone else speaking about race or gender at all is out of bounds right from the start. Behind this perverse desire to deem certain topics completely out of bounds, except for certain people who for one reason or another have the right to speak of them, resides the assumption, never openly stated, that a dumbed-down world in which difficult information is elided so that no one ever feels unsafe or offended surpasses ethically a world of open-eyed, open-minded intelligence that relies not upon ideas that make us feel safe, but upon the best facts available, regardless of how they make us feel. Unfortunately, to the extent that ideas may be considered not just offensive, but too offensive to be spoken, our ability to express ideas, or even just to cite plain facts, is compromised. Since ordinary sanity requires openness to honesty, anything less is a dumbing down. A dilemma ensues. Often, the brightest among us keep their views to themselves, falling silent rather than risk arousing the self-righteous wrath and the witless verbal attacks, or worse, of the lesser lights who prefer emotional comfort to truth. Nowadays, university professors run scared. If they say the wrong thing, even if factually correct, their words are likely to be in play on social media in a trice. Then there will be the call to the dean's office, etc. Working to straighten out our ways of discussing gender and skin color seems a worthy project. Eliminating thoughtful views on those matters because the speaker of those views is somehow disqualified due to skin color, gender, or any other factor is not the way, I say. I have no intention of offending anyone, but in this space I must say what I see, and you can always stop reading whenever you like. I will speak as plainly and clearly as I can, so that any objections at least stand a chance of being objections to what I actually say. If you identify as Jewish, there is no biological or racial truth in that at all. None. No one is a Jew biologically or racially. Race does not exist. Observing the physical characteristics of another human standing silently before you offers no inside information about that human. Absolutely none. To imagine that skin color can offer such information is pure delusion. Regardless of the color of your skin or that of the person you are observing, if you imagine knowing something about that person based on physical appearance, that is a racist delusion, and that is the point. If you have dark skin, and on seeing a light-skinned human you think you are looking at a white man, whereas you are black, that is the form of impaired comprehension that I call splitting. That split was imposed upon you, and now you accept it, embrace it, defend it, and even pass it on to your children. Unless you are able to see that culturally imposed and now self-imposed limitation as the lie it is, you will never be what I call awake. If you live in the USA, for example, and your skin is dark, you may feel that since blacks are a minority that has been oppressed historically, you are obliged to accept that identity. If you didn't, you would be acting white. You may feel that you have not chosen to identify as black, but have had that identity forced upon you. I can't disagree with that. I know the history firsthand. I traveled in the American South when Jim Crow was the law, and colored waiting rooms and whites-only water fountains were the rule. So when middle school teacher Julia Blount posted the following, I knew what she meant. Quote, "Dear white America, it is somewhat strange to address this to you, given that I strongly identify with many aspects of your culture and am half white myself. Yet today is another day you have forced me to decide what race I am. And as always, when you force me, I fall decidedly into person of color. Every comment or post I have read today voicing some version of disdain for the people of Baltimore, I can't understand, or they're destroying their own community, or destruction of property, or thugs, tells me that many of you are not listening." Unquote. Yes, Julia, given the last 400 years of human history, how can you not identify as black in a culture of racism in which a rich, white-skinned guilty man stands a better chance in court than a poor, dark-skinned innocent one, and policing includes such imaginary crimes as driving in the wrong neighborhood while black? I get that. And I understand also why, faced with an ignoramus who denies that racism exists at all, you might need to educate and orient that racism denier by saying something like, "If you were black like me, you wouldn't be talking that way." But history, politics, and racism have nothing to do with awake. And awake has nothing to do with how others see you, but rather is about how and what you see. That is what is being discussed here, not social mores, which are what they are and change only slowly. So even if you do find it necessary to say something like "black like me," I advise saying it with fingers crossed behind your back. Because, like Julia Blount, you really know that you are not black unless some racist makes you be. Awakeness sees with open eyes the history of racism and its crimes against humanity, and sees the racism that infuses everything even today, but will not allow racism to be reenacted within one's own mind. In your deepest heart of hearts, you probably know you are not black, and probably know that the light-skinned cat over there isn't white either. Or vice versa, you probably know, like me, that you are not white, and that dark-skinned dude isn't black either. If a clear-eyed outlook is desired, it's best not to reenact that split. Social pressures encourage reenacting it. If one can identify as human and nothing lesser, the split will have healed within one's own mind. That will not, it is true, cure racism. Nothing you arrive at can do that. But at least within your own mind, the trance of false identification will have run its course. There may be comfort to be found in identifying as one thing or another. From the perspective of evolutionary psychology, the tribe is most conducive to genetic survival, not going it alone. So it is somewhat instinctive to want to fit in, to get with the program, to go along to get along. We all like to feel connected and accepted. It's just natural. But tribal days are over and cannot return. In this interconnected world, tribal identifications are fictions imposed culturally upon the freshness, curiosity, and freedom of our minds, which then have to sort through those lies and discard them. In an awakened understanding, no identity applies but our identity as primate humans, with the concomitant human faculty of self-awareness. That faculty is unrelated entirely to skin color or gender. To be clear, I am not denying the phenomena of white privilege, economic privilege, male privilege, or gender discrimination. All four exist on this planet, and no one, I say, should pretend they don't. I am saying that one can see the injustice of those phenomena clearly and work towards ending them without having to identify as anything but human. To stop identifying as is what I mean by not taking refuge in second-hand notions. I don't mean just the false notions of race and gender identification, but also religious and philosophical beliefs of every stripe, which are by definition second-hand. This is not to say that all beliefs are as unfounded or invalid as so-called race. An idea may be more or less valid in proportion to how it agrees with or can predict events and conditions in the real world, including the psychological world. But regardless of validity, beliefs are second-hand by definition. If you know something firsthand because you experience it, you don't need to believe in it. You may believe that existentialism is more valid than Christianity, or vice versa, but I advise avoiding identification with either one. I strongly advise against saying, even to oneself, I am a Christian, or I am an existentialist, or a non-dualist, or a feminist, or a socialist, or a white cisgendered male, or you fill in the blank. If identification as comes to an end, that leaves you as you are in this moment, depending on nothing. Not religion, not gender, not economic class, not nationality, none of it. No thing. Yes, this abstinence from all identification may feel lonely, but it has the virtue of being honest, true, and awake. Nevertheless, it takes plenty of gumption to stop identifying, because identification is the way most humans think and speak at all times. The news reports will continue saying that blacks believe so-and-so, as if there really were such a group as blacks. So great is the pressure to conform to racist terminology as whites and blacks, that relatively few people will understand race as a figment of human misunderstanding, driven by the need to categorize what cannot be categorized, this aliveness. So in most situations, unless I happen to be with eyes wide open people, or perhaps a group of geneticists, I will find myself alone in this view, completely alone. That might feel lonely, but what is the alternative? Drink the Kool-Aid? An old Sufi tale goes this way. Quote, one day the prophet Khidr met Moses, who told him that before long all the water in the world would dry up and be replaced with new water, but that the new water would make people insane. So Khidr began to preach. To save yourselves, you must stockpile all the water presently here on earth. Save the old water, and you will be saved from madness. But among the multitude who heard Khidr preach, only one very bright man heeded his advice. That man collected all the water he could. He went to rivers, streams, ponds, and pools, and drew water from every well in the area. He filled any container he could find and hid the old water in a secret cave. Then one day, just as Khidr had foretold, the rivers stopped flowing, and the rivers, wells, ponds, and pools dried up. No matter where people looked, there was scant water to be found. The one man who had heeded Khidr, taking care to make sure no one followed him, went to his cave and hid there, drinking the water he had accumulated. Soon it began to rain, and rivers were once again flowing. The people who had been close to dying from thirst were delighted, and appreciated water as they never had before. The man in the cave, confident that everything was fine again, left the cave and returned to his village. When he saw people drinking, he approached and called out, "Hello," but no one responded. Soon the man discovered that his neighbors had gone mad. They spoke an entirely different language from the one they had once spoken, and had no memory of the time before the drought. The man tried in every way he could to tell them, but when he spoke, no one could understand him. To them it appeared that he had gone mad. He tried to reason with them. That riverbed was only rocks and dust. The well was dry. The lake was dust. The people asked themselves, "What is he saying?" He could not understand their language, but he did understand the expressions on their faces. They shook their fists and shouted. Soon he became afraid. They would never remember the world as it had once been. They would never understand what he was trying to say. Khidr had been right. So he returned to the safety of his cave and back to his secret water. He refused to drink the new water that drove everyone mad. No, he would remain in the safety of his world with his own water. But as time went on, he felt lonelier and lonelier. No family, no friends, no one to talk to. One day, his loneliness became too much to bear. He returned to the village and took a big drink from the community well. Instantly, he could understand the language that the others were speaking, and soon forgot all about his cave and the old water. His old friends were happy for him. "You were out of your mind," they said, "but now you are okay again." And because he no longer remembered, he did not dispute it. Unquote. When you confess to a sense of nothingness that the wind blows through, and speak of the empty hole of loneliness, I see the promptings of an awakening mind that has had just about enough of trying to escape loneliness by seeking to define this indefinable presence as anything but what it is, a complete and total mystery. As for the friends who no longer like what you have to say, those lost friendships are just collateral damage to this awakening. Let them go. Jump right into that hole of aloneness, I say, and see what it's like to be on your own without trying to define yourself as anything but this aliveness, this flow,